President Salovey and Mata Murat, Professor Rob Nixon, colleagues and friends, and our dear students, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon! Good afternoon and welcome to the Tanner Lectures on Human Values hosted by the Whitney Humanities Center. My name is Kajata Anyeka and I direct the center. One of the exciting roles of my colleagues and I at the Whitney is advising the president on the selection of Tanner lecturers. I am grateful to my predecessor, Alice Kaplan, who worked with me to propose this year's exceptional speaker, Rob Nixon, the Thomas A. and Corey C. Barron Family Professor in Humanities and Environment at Princeton. Every generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it, Frantz Fanon writes in the mid-20th century. What Fanon did not say is that each mission mandates its own precepts and textual accompaniment, that is, its own devotional text, one might say a scriptural guide. Fanon's own work accompanied and continued to mobilize intellectual work and praxis around decolonization, the dominant issue of the 20th century. What is the mission of our own times, of this generation? I think you will agree with me that the environmental crisis and this unequal distribution of risk looms large as the problematic of our contemporary moment, at least one of them. So we're extremely lucky on that note to have Rob Nixon at the forefront of understanding the predicament of planetary survival in an era of neoliberal extraction and climate change. Prof. Nixon's slow violence and environmentalism of the poor has quickly become a lodestar since its publication. It has offered not only a conceptual language, but also a framework and a model of breathtaking creative intellectual achievement. It has become a landmark test shaping and redefining fields and offering an intellectual model to a generation of scholars in the humanities and beyond, including many on our campus. Professor Nixon's visit comes at a special moment of strength in humanities and on work on the environment here at Yale, all under the leadership of President Salovey, who announced in the fall that this is the last year of his presidency. President Salovey's transformative leadership has expanded intellectual possibilities, including adding new depth and breadth to the humanities, as a recent article in the Yale News frames it. In his work as president, he has consistently emphasized the importance of the humanities and human values to a holistic educational experience. In my first meeting with him following my appointment as director last year, I was struck by his account of an admiration for the great humanistic intellectual tradition here at Yale, including my own English department home. I was also moved by his recollection of growing up immersed in the literary arts in New York. I won't give away your secret, Mr. President. I will leave it there. The humanities has thrived under President Salovey, but also as inquiries into the environment and climate. The Yale Planetary Solutions, established under his watch, is at the forefront of accelerating action and advancing solutions to the greatest challenges of our time. The environmental humanities has also benefited from the expansion in faculty and curricular offerings and student interest. All of us at the Whitney will miss President Salovey's commitment to the Tanner Lectures, and we hope you will join us after your well-deserved break for future events. Please join me in thanking President Salovey for his extraordinary commitment to the humanities. Before we start, a few words on the Tanner Lectures on Human Values, which were established by the American scholar, industrialist, and philanthropist Robert Clark Tanner and his wife, Grace Tanner. Educated at the University of Utah, Stanford, and Harvard, Robert Tanner went on to become a New Testament scholar and professor at the University of Utah. To pay for his education, he founded a jewelry company while still an undergraduate. His company, O.C. Tanner, which manufactures employee recognition awards, became an extraordinary success. It is on the base of this success that the Tanner's philanthropy was built. These efforts included Tanner lectures at Yale and at a number of other institutions in the US, the UK, and beyond. Appointment as a Tanner lecturer is a recognition of uncommon achievement and outstanding ability in the field of human values. The lectureships are international and intercultural and are meant to transcend ethnic, national, religious, and ideological distinctions. In creating the lectureships, Professor Tanner said, and I quote, "I see these lectures simply as a search for a better understanding of human behavior and human values. This understanding may be pursued for its own intrinsic worth, but it may also eventually have practical consequences for the quality of person and social life," close quote. Professor Nixon's lectures today and tomorrow are in the spirit of Tanner's vision, in that they are dedicated to the consequences of the environment for the quality of person and social life, especially on the margins. Please join us again tomorrow at 4:30 for part 2 of the lectures. To introduce Professor Nixon is the tireless leader of our Environmental Humanities program, whose institutional building work has created new vistas for research and collaboration on campus. I am thrilled to introduce Paul Sabin, Randolph W. Townsend Jr., Professor of History and Professor of American Studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sabin.
Thank you, Kajistan, for including me in the Tanner Lectures event today. And many thanks to you for your superb leadership of the Whitney Humanities Center. And also thanks to the Whitney staff for putting together this terrific program, which I know took a lot of work. It's truly a great privilege to have the opportunity to introduce Professor Rob Nixon. Back when I was in graduate school in history at Berkeley in the late 1990s, I was part of a group of graduate students that was all struggling with a common concern. How can we do serious, ambitious scholarly work in our disciplines while also engaging with real-world environmental problems? We saw examples of special people who became this kind of public intellectual through sheer force of will and talent. But we wondered whether it might be possible to teach early to mid-career academics and others the skills of public intellectual leadership and create a supportive community for them. We went on to launch a nonprofit organization called the Environmental Leadership Program that sponsored a fellowship program with this goal. And more recently here at Yale, I've had the opportunity to also collaborate with others in establishing the Yale Environmental Humanities Program. And this has had a similar goal of trying to create a supportive community of environmental scholars and thinkers from across the humanities and to encourage path-breaking scholarship and also nurture people who could go on to become interdisciplinary leaders within academia and beyond. Through a small grants program, we encourage experimentation and innovation in the public humanities. And through a graduate certificate program, we seek to teach skills related to interdisciplinary thinking and collaboration. I go on at such length about these projects because I think they help explain why it's such a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce Professor Nixon, who's a distinguished scholar and public intellectual leader whose groundbreaking work has profoundly shaped our understanding of the connections between the humanities, the environment, and social justice. Professor Nixon, as Kajistan mentioned, is the Thomas A. and Curry C. Barron Family Professor in the Humanities and the Environment at Princeton, where he's a professor of English and is affiliated with the Princeton Environmental Institute's initiative in the environmental humanities. Before joining Princeton in 2015, Nixon held the Rachel Carson Professorship in English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he was also active in the founding of the Center for Culture, History, and the Environment, which is another leading environmental humanities effort that we actually modeled our project on to a certain extent. Nixon is the author of 4 books in the fields of environmental studies, post-colonial studies, nonfiction, and contemporary literature. And his writing draws creatively on his experiences growing up in apartheid South Africa and then leaving to spend much of his adult life teaching literature in the United States. In Dreambirds, The Natural History of a Fantasy, for example, Nixon weaves together a memoir of his youth and family on the edge of South Africa's Karoo Desert with a social history of those farmers who chased ostrich farming dreams in South Africa and America. And in his best-known work, Slow Violence and the Environmentals and the Poor, Nixon powerfully articulates the insidious, gradually unfolding forms of environmental harm that disproportionately affect marginalized communities, especially in the Global South. The book's a profound critique of how we perceive and address environmental challenges, urging us to reconceptualize violence and justice in the context of environmental degradation and social inequality. Slow Violence received several prizes, including the Sprout Prize for the best book in environmental studies, the Interdisciplinary Humanities Award for the best book to straddle disciplines in the humanities, and the Asley Award for the best book in environmental literary studies. Slow Violence won an even greater prize, however, I think, which is its broad influence among teachers and students thinking about environmental inequalities. The concept of slow violence is one of those rare ideas that has leapt out of the page and into common discourse. The book's regularly assigned in undergraduate courses and is a staple on graduate examination lists. Just this afternoon, I was in my office, procrastinating on these introductory thoughts. So I started to read a student paper on environmental history and literature. And I was just a couple of pages in, and there was Rob Nixon's Slow Violence on the page as a model for thinking about environmental destruction over an extended period of time. This concept of slow violence has engaged a broad audience, bridging theoretical insights with real-world activism and policymaking. It's given people a language to articulate and to confront often overlooked environmental injustices that accumulate over time and space and aren't evenly perceived and identified. And as such, slow violence is not just a scholarly term, but also a mobilizing concept that's galvanized action and has helped expand our conception of what counts as environmentalism in different parts of the world. Befitting this broad public influence, Nixon is also has been a frequent contributor to the New York Times, has written for the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Guardian, the Nation, many other publications. And so in all these different ways, Nixon has truly been a model for how to engage in both scholarly and public writing on environmental concerns and social movements. And for all of these reasons, I'm delighted to welcome him to Yale for this year's Tanner Lectures entitled Ecology and Equity, Environmental Justice Revisited. Professor Nixon.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to President Louv and the committee, and particularly to Kajetan for inviting me here. It's a great honor to be here, and it's a great honor to talk on this particular subject, which is one close to my heart. So I want to thank the entire Tanner committee as well. And Diane Barrett Brown for all the work you put in, and Kajetan particularly for his hugely influential leadership at the crossroads between post-colonial studies and environmental humanities. You're really fortunate to have him as your leader. So one of the most consequential intellectual developments in recent years has been the prominent rise of the environmental justice movement, both as a capacious interdisciplinary field, but also as a set of strategies in the world whereby to impact public policy. So I've been teaching and writing in the field of environmental justice for about 30 years. And for much of that time, I'd get bemused questions. You work on environmental what? But over the past 5 years, however, environmental justice issues have become much more publicly visible and publicly legible and more influential in the US in particular, in large part because of the combined impact of the Green New Deal, the Black Lives Matter movement, Standing Rock, the unequal racial and demographic effects of COVID, and Generation Z's deep commitment to linking the environmental crisis with other social crises, which in the past might have seemed like a separate deal. And so the way that the environmental crisis has been linked to the housing crisis, the policing crisis, the incarceration crisis, and broader crises in the cultures of care, that is care for both vulnerable human communities and embattled ecological communities. All this in a neoliberal era of austerity and social abandonment. So in consequence, a broader acceptance that environmental health and public health are inextricably entangled has now become more and more influential, opening up a vital range of possibilities for collaborative, consequential change. Most environmental justice work foregrounds the unequal burdens of environmental harms. But in today's talk, and I want to center the subject a little bit differently and discuss a significant but less frequently engaged dimension to environmental justice, which is the unequal access to environmental pleasures, and particularly the restorative powers of green spaces. Environmental neuroscientists are now mapping how time spent in nature can provide an astonishing array of physical and psychological benefits. Why then do environmental pleasures remain so inequitably distributed? How can we better understand why such disparities, historically constructed and politically reinforced, persist? And what can be done to remedy such discrepancies in access to nature's health-enhancing pleasures? Of course, the primate known as Homo sapiens resides inside nature, not outside of it, as scholars like Raymond Williams, Anne McClintock, Kajetan Heka, Ed Yong, and many others have emphasized. Yet a tenacious view persists that regards culture as nature's opposite, as if by stepping into nature we were stepping outside of society. But social discrimination reaches deep into forests, fields, and waterways. In today's lecture, I will consider how that happens through two particular lenses: environmental justice and environmental neuroscience. And one of the things I like to do is to try to bring into conversation data-driven and non-data-driven disciplines and see how they might illuminate each other. Legally, all citizens are entitled to equal access to green public spaces. But experientially and historically, a different reality prevails. Force fields of cultural power, as well as forms of covert and overt social policing, may impede different communities' access to the so-called nature cure, aka the green dividend, to use a fiscalized term favored by environmental neuroscientists. Every nature cure or green dividend exists within a complex, sometimes violent topography of social power. Something more complex is involved here than simple individual predilections for or against spending time in nature. The issues at stake are historical, social, and structural. For many, the outdoors has not always been so great. Let me offer a few embodied examples of what I mean by this. In her guidebook to relative strangers, Journeys into Race, Motherhood, and History, Camille Dungy recalls hiking near the Cumberland Gap. An ominous rustling puts Dungy on high alert. But the rustling that unsettles her is the rustling of lingering shadows from slavery's collective traumatic past. Dungy loves being in nature, but she pursues her passion judiciously, showing regional discretion. She prefers hiking the American West to hiking the Southeast, where, in her words, trees are thick with a southern brand of sorrow. I thought the panic attacks I suffered when I wandered into the hills near the Cumberland Gap had solely to do with my concern that every rustling leaf would reveal a Confederate ghost, unquote. After hiking alone near her Lynchburg home, Dungy declares, quote, I was afraid of what humans had done to other humans in those woods, so I'd come to fear the forests and the trees, unquote. Dungy wonders whether her unease on Virginia's trails may be epigenetic, that is, whether the effects of a historical trauma may have been passed down intergenerationally, finding expression in her genes. Like Dungy, the Chickasaw writer Linda Hogan speculates about the epigenetic dimensions to collective trauma on a trip outdoors. In her essay, Department of the Interior, Hogan describes gazing at a fenced-in remnant buffalo herd near her Colorado home, along some white tourists. Hogan is prompted to wonder, quote, "Do the buffalo's cells, like mine, remember the terror, the changed world, and destroyed land," unquote. In other words, could genocide register epigenetically, not just across human generations, but across other species too? Gay Mexican-American writer Richard Rodriguez also distinguishes between the way many white folk engage with the outdoors and his own more tenuous position. After friends encourage Rodriguez to savor California's wild spaces, he sets off hesitantly on a hike. 3 minutes beyond the trailhead, he hears rustling in the undergrowth. His body tenses, panic sets in. Rodriguez wonders, quote, "Is that a squirrel rustling, or I'm about to be ambushed by Snow White and the 7 militias?" Unquote. In reflecting on outdoor trauma, Dungy, Hogan, and Rodriguez, in their different ways, all illustrate what I've called an environmental double consciousness. On the one hand, Dungy hikes to relax. On the other, she hikes in a state of vigilance against threats that might erupt from the ghost-riddled past. Environmental double consciousness suffuses much nature writing deriving from marginalized or historically oppressed communities who, for reasons of race, gender, class, sexuality, disability, caste, religion, may often experience time spent in nature less as bandage than as wound. Part 2, Environmental Justice and Environmental Neuroscience. If the 21st century has seen environmental justice achieve unprecedented prominence, environmental neuroscience has witnessed a similar 21st century upsurge. In light of the experiences I've just recounted, what would it mean to consider neuroscience from an environmental justice vantage point? To answer that question, we must briefly clarify the parameters of environmental neuroscience. Dr. Mark Berman at the University of Chicago's Environmental Neuroscience Laboratory says of the field's central focus, quote, "A growing body of research is demonstrating that we cannot be healthy, that our brains do not work optimally if we don't spend time in natural environments. Spending time in nature is not a luxury, it's a necessity," unquote. The first thing that flashes up on the Environmental Neuroscience Lab at Chicago's homepage is, quote, "How do we quantify the person, the environment, and their interaction," unquote. My interest today is in exploring what kinds of outdoor experiences might elude such quantification. It's no coincidence that the 21st century rise of environmental neuroscience coincides with the rise of digital culture. Life has become less outward bound and more screen bound. An average American checks their phones 150 times a day. As a result, American children now spend 50% less time playing in unstructured ways outdoors compared with their parents. Could the rewilding of childhood help counter the digital rewiring of childhood? Scholars have coined several terms to describe what one calls our epidemic dislocation from the outdoors, unquote. Some refer to nature deficit disorder or nature withdrawal syndrome, or simply nature deprivation. The solution? Greater immersion in nature so as to avail ourselves of what has been variously dubbed the nature cure, the nature boost, or the green dividend. Much environmental neuroscience hinges on this simple proposition. Being in nature is good for us in a measurable way. Study after study quantifies the benefits of stepping away from our addictive devices and losing ourselves in the natural world. Researchers can now chart in granular detail the green dividend's biochemical markers in the human body, thereby demonstrating how time in nature reduces blood pressure, reduces blood sugar, stress hormones, ADHD, and heart rate, as well as reducing the risk of obesity, strokes, dementia, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic disease overall. Demonstrating, 2, how time in nature strengthens the immune system, improves lung function, increases longevity, boosts cognition, boosts spatial and visual memory, intelligence, reasoning, and self-confidence. How time in nature, moreover, can lower a person's cortisol. The science can now quantify how natural immersion offers relief from digital dispersion. What an immense picnic hamper of physiological and psychological benefits the environmental neuroscientists have revealed. But amidst all the studies quantifying those benefits, some cautionary observations may be in order. I've yet to encounter a neuroscientific study that maps the biometrics of environmental double consciousness. To the contrary, the neuroscience leans into evolutionary and genetic explanations while subordinating or ignoring altogether issues paramount to environmental justice as a field. In particular, by downplaying the environmental justice concerned with exposing and redressing the discriminatory cultures, politics, and histories that all too often shadow the outdoors. Many of the green dividends proponents draw inspiration from the sociobiologist E.O. Wilson, especially from his biophilia thesis, his idea that because Homo sapiens evolved in nature, we are hardwired to function better when we spend time outdoors. Estrangement from nature, according to this logic, is not just unhealthy, but unnatural. But typically in the science of the green dividend, the beneficiary is posited as a universal subject. We see this in papers entitled The Nature Cure, How Time Outdoors Transforms Our Memory, Imagination, and Logic, or Why Walking Helps Us Think. Richard Louv's bestseller, Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, exhorts readers to help, quote, heal the broken bond between our young and nature, unquote. And Florence Williams, in her book Nature Fix, explains how, quote, nature makes us happy because of a neural mechanism in our ventral visual pathway, unquote. Furthermore, Williams explains, scientists can now map how, quote, the color green unlocks the pathways to health in our brain, unquote. One notices in all of this how a species level we, our, and us does a lot of heavy lifting. So in today's talk, I want to suggest taking a different tack. Instead of the non-specific species thinking that tends to predominate in the neuroscience, I'll offer 4 brief countervailing narratives. Narratives that depend less on quantitative precision, but more on an inhabited understanding of specific histories of social power as they impact environmental experience. I've drawn these 4 narratives from 4 very different societies: Pakistan, Britain, the US, and the West Bank. I take seriously what environmental neuroscience is saying about the nature cure. However, I also seek through these 4 narratives to better understand the complex reasons why nature's healing potential often remains unrealized. Yes, immersive time outdoors can deliver extraordinary health benefits, but losing yourself in nature is not an equally accessible ideal. Part 3. Pakistan. Is your blue sky the same as my blue sky? Scientists talk about blue sky research for a reason. Blue skies typically connote freedom, openness, possibilities, light, warmth, happiness, not least for children hankering to play outdoors. In 2015, the Chinese TV journalist Chai Jing directed an environmental documentary, Under the Dome, after her daughter developed health conditions from chronic air pollution. What kind of future could China offer her daughter, Chai Jing wondered. Would her daughter have her health further compromised by the toxic grey dome, the sullen anti-sky that hung over so many Chinese megacities? Chai Jing worried that her daughter might never experience a blue sky, blue skies were becoming an endangered species. Judging's film struck a nerve. 150 million Chinese viewers rushed to see the movie in the first 2 weeks, prompting the regime to ban it. But the film helped draw to the surface a public discontent with the nation's grey skies. Such was the film's impact that fans dubbed it the Chinese Silent Spring. Under the Dome helped pressure President Xi Jinping into a commitment to, quote-unquote, return blue skies to China, unquote. But for some children, the return of blue skies symbolizes not hope, but terror. Take Zubair Rehman, a 13-year-old Pakistani boy who for years lived not under the dome, but under the drone. As Rehman observed to a visiting journalist, quote, now I prefer cloudy days when the drones don't fly. When the sky brightens and becomes blue, the drones return, and so does my fear. Children don't play so often now and have stopped going to school. Education isn't possible as long as the drones circle overhead, unquote. Most days, the sky above his town was noisy with American drones. Before they haunted the sky, his parents had encouraged him to play outside. But the drone's arrival had shrunk his world. Zubair would go to bed praying for the blue to go away. Now and then he'd get lucky. He'd wake smiling to a gloriously grey day, a day grey enough to demilitarize the skies, allowing him to skip outside and play. Nor should we mistake Zubair's predicament as some bizarre outlier. Thousands of children live like him, afraid to venture out beneath terrorizing blue skies. Part 4, UK, A Walk in the Woods. In her memoir, Landscape for a Good Woman, the British historian Carolyn Steedman recalls taking a life-changing woodland walk with her father when she was a little girl. Steedman's white working-class father takes her for a stroll until they come upon a bluebell glade. Father and daughter have a tenuous relationship. The father stoops to pick some flowers. What he struggles to say in words, he hopes instead to say with bluebells. A man in gamekeeper's tweed strides down toward them, shouting and gesticulating. He yells at the father for picking bluebells. Then the gamekeeper snatches the bouquet and throws it to the ground, crushing her father's loving gesture underfoot. Something else is crushed, Steedman's ability to look up to him thereafter in the same way. It matters in Steedman's memory that the shouting gamekeeper descended on father and daughter from the hill above, as if the land's steep topography were reinforcing the gradient of inequity that separated her working-class father from the gamekeeper's socially buttressed power. Father and daughter quickly retreated back down the hill from where they came. In Steedman's words, quote-unquote, the tweed man was the victor looking down on them, overseeing their departure. All childhoods are provincial. They start from me, from us, from here. In the absence of a social analysis, where we are becomes the center of everything. When you're a child, you live life close up, so close that life's shaping fundamentals for a time remain hidden, until the wider world intrudes, instilling in the child an awareness of the force fields exerted by social inequality and prejudice. For Steedman, that nature walk laid bare her father's secret, exposing a chasm between his private authority in the home and his lowly public standing. She pitied her father, but also felt estranged from him, angered by his humiliation. When a child witnesses a parent's public powerlessness, whether on grounds of class, gender, race, ethnicity, religion, sexuality, it is painful for both parties. But crucially, what happened in those bluebell woods was more specific than a public shaming. For the purposes of my argument today, we note how nature is weaponized in that bluebell scene, the natural world becoming not just the site, but the instrument of the father's humiliation. The gamekeeper mobilized the flowers to put this working-class man in his place, to show him up for what he is, a man of no real power or consequence in the eyes of the law, and now in the eyes of his daughter too. Outdoors, the father ceases to be recognizable as a father. After that encounter with the gamekeeper, Steedman describes her father as shrinking into, quote-unquote, a silhouette of a man. Studies touting the health benefits that flow from time spent outdoors seldom take such power disparities into account. Nature is a very specific type of public space because in the dominant discourse it possesses strong associations with peace, relaxation, and health. But why venture outdoors if, in so doing, you fear losing your dignity through micro or macro aggressions? Rachel Carson once observed, quote, "If a child is to keep alive their inborn sense of wonder, they need the companionship of at least one adult who can share it, rediscovering with the child the natural joy, excitement, and mystery of the world we live in," unquote. In general, this is true. But what happens when the child's adult-accompanied journey into nature exposes them less to joy, excitement, and mystery than to raw fear and injustice? Part 5, USA. When the trees move in. We live in a world that is simultaneously getting more urban and warmer. So adding trees to cities seems like a no-brainer. Expanding the urban canopy helps mitigate extreme heat. Poorer city neighborhoods like black communities in the US that have been historically subjected to redlining typically have fewer trees. This leaves inhabitants more exposed to premature morbidity from sustained high temperatures, the single greatest health threat from climate breakdown. More trees, less concrete, equals fewer urban heat islands. Moreover, trees can help offset pollution from the highways, coal-fired plants, bus depots, and hospital incinerators that are concentrated in low-income BIPOC communities, a legacy of racist zoning. Planting more London planes or ginkgos in a community like Harlem may help advance tree equity. But when new trees move in, they may also quicken anxieties about the community's future and identity. We see as much in Michael Henry Adams' 2016 essay, The End of Black Harlem. Adams describes standing on Frederick Douglass Boulevard, where he has joined activists to protest gentrification. Harlem rents are soaring in a community where 85% of people rent, and where the median annual income in 2016 was $37,000. Property speculation, vacant second homes, and Airbnb are all shrinking the housing stock. Under pressure from developers, Harlem continues to hemorrhage black residents. So Adams has turned up in this protest, chanting in unison with friends and neighbors, "Save Harlem now, save Harlem now." Two black boys, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, bike by. The boys break and circle back, curious to find out what the hubbub is all about. "Why are you all yelling that?" one asks. When Adams explains that locals are being priced out of their own neighborhood, the boy turns to his friend and says, "You see, I told you they didn't plant those trees for us," unquote. Adams does not know the boys on the bikes, but their awareness of gentrification's sign system saddens him. Quote, "It was painful to realize that even a kid could see in every new building, every historic renovation, every boutique clothing shop, indeed in every tree and every flower and in every park improvement, not a life-enhancing benefit, but a harbinger of his own displacement," unquote. How can we best read the boy's response? When neuroscientists might see trees delivering a green dividend, improving the health profiles of Harlem's children, what the boy sees instead are trees compromised by ulterior motives. When he notices some ginkgos appearing improbably on his street, he smells the approach of richer, mostly whiter people. Of this much he is sure: trees aren't us. The boy doesn't read the new trees as allies in the fight against heat islands, childhood asthma, and premature dementia. He reads them as gentrification shock troops. That boy's instincts are not paranoid. In the mid-1990s, the New York City Council started openly discussing planting trees in order to push up property prices in order to expand the city's tax base. As fresh planted trees spread shade, developers can start listing a neighborhood as leafy. Leafy is a dog whistle word. Code for rents will rise, code for desirable. In rebranding a neighborhood desirable, developers may position current residents as undesirables who lower the tone of their own historic community. Leafy may seem to promise a green dividend for residents, but deliver environmental gentrification instead, with all the health stresses that accompany community fracture and displacement. Might the boy's suspicion toward the trees appearing on his street suggest lines of research that environmental neuroscience could more actively pursue, like, if too few urban trees is one marker of discrimination, what if, as the trees introduced rise, so do the rents? What if the trees deliver better air that the residents, anxiously anticipating their own displacement, can no longer afford to breathe? What are the biometrics of all of that? The geographers Winifred Curran and Trina Hamilton have coined the phrase just green enough to describe efforts to green working class neighborhoods, but not to the extent that environmental gentrification results. Just green enough may involve preserving parklets instead of improving large tourist-attracting parks. Just green enough may involve cleaning up industrial sites without driving away blue-collar jobs. And above all, just green enough should involve a local democratic involvement in planning from the outset, rather than being a nominal afterthought in a developer-controlled process. For, as Curran and Hamilton argue, the surge in environmental awareness in cities has not been matched with concern for social equity, unquote. All too often in America, greening whitens. Part 6, West Bank, an accusatory thistle. As a boy, Raja Shehadeh loved to roam the Ramallah hills. Quote, "The hills and fields were our playgrounds. There was no sense of danger outside," unquote. Shehadeh experienced nature as expansive, welcoming, pre-political. He especially relished walking after spring rains when wildflowers festooned the hills, poppies, asphodel, cyclamen, thyme, and the purple thistle, known in Arabic as natch. In adulthood, Shehadeh's psychological health depended on those walks, which he continued for 25 years. His work as a human rights lawyer was fraught with stress. He was committed to defending Palestinian property owners whose land the Israeli state sought to confiscate. That work left him vulnerable to attacks from both sides. The Israeli prosecutors and courts targeted him for trying to obstruct their efforts to seize Palestinian land. But some Palestinians berated Shehadeh as well, arguing that to operate within Israel's discriminatory legal system was unacceptable. Despite that pressure, Shehadeh held his course, believing that every Palestinian property saved was a worthy cause. To survive his traumatic work, he habitually fled to the Ramallah hills to decompress. Out there he could be a child again, sustaining the necessary illusion that it was nature, not politics, that enveloped him. Out there he could breathe again, escaping what Kimberly Bain has called in a Black American context, quote, infrastructures of suffocation, unquote. But year by year the hills began to change. His walks became obstacle courses, harassment by armed settlers, gunmen shooting at him, humiliation at checkpoints, long depressing detours around the segregationist wall, more detours to avoid roads that the Israeli government had banned Palestinians from using. A formerly straightforward hike turned into an anxiety-producing maze of micro and macro aggression. It became harder and harder for Shehadeh to inhabit nature as a release from politics. One particular plant came to embody his vexing struggle to relax outdoors. That plant is natch, a native thistle widespread in the West Bank. Shahade had often encountered natch on his boyhood walks, but the thistle Shahade encountered in those early years had no political thorns. But now an encounter with natch could shatter his peace of mind, leaving him churning with anger and anxiety. If a Palestinian was found to have natch growing on their land, an Israeli court could wield the plant's presence as evidence of neglect or property abandonment. The presence of natch could license the Israeli state to seize the Palestinian property in question. In this way, Israel had weaponized nature against Palestinian landowners. In court, Shahade saw prosecutors and judges treat natch as an incriminating weed. Now, weed, of course, is not a botanical category, but a subjective designation, a way to declare a plant species invasive and undesirable. Ironically, the so-called weed is a native species, not an invasive. So the Israeli state had incorporated this blameless thistle into its artillery of dispossession, wielding a native plant to evict native human inhabitants. And so the botany of belonging became implicated in the fraught human politics of belonging. Let the desert bloom, but not with the wrong flowers and the wrong people. In childhood, the thistle had been integral to the ecologies that afforded Shahade health and joy. But how could he now separate the simple botanical natch from the natch that had morphed into an agent of occupation politics? Now Shahade viewed natch with a kind of environmental double consciousness, as a ubiquitous, pretty purple plant, and as damning courtroom evidence. Like that Harlem boy, Shahade saw how a plant could become dispossession's harbinger. Shahade started to walk differently. He became more vigilant. He took greater care about what he carried on his person. No maps, no compass, no camera. If an Israeli patrol stopped him and discovered such items in his backpack, they might arrest him, as had happened to fellow Palestinian recreational walkers he had known. Shahade made other changes too. Walking solo had become too dangerous. He feared isolated confrontations with Israeli military patrols, checkpoint guards, and settlers, often hot-headed and well-armed. Now, when he walked at all, he walked in groups. He couldn't afford to walk in a state of absent-minded solitude. Conclusion. Closing the enjoyment gap. As environmental challenges keep barreling towards us, we need to ready ourselves by building more robust and therefore more diverse alliances. Crucially, such alliance building involves understanding and redressing the structural reasons why so many social groups may mistrust the outdoors. As a simple matter of justice, it is essential that we widen the pathways to environmental pleasure and thereby allow more communities to access the cornucopias of psychological and physiological benefits that neuroscientists have been pointing to. So a critical dimension to environmental justice is finding creative ways to narrow the enjoyment gap. There is no simple one-size-fits-all panacea, but I take heart from 4 strategies that activists are deploying with increasing frequency and increasing success. The first strategy, using the archives to give a discriminated group's outdoor presence the ballast of history. Artists and writers like Ingrid Pollard and Dan Guthrie in the UK, Carolyn Finney, Camille Dungy, and Shelton Johnson in the US, Paula Kahumbu in Kenya, Jacob Lamini in South Africa, and many others, have all helped recuperate long histories, often long-buried histories, of outdoor belonging. As Finney observes, quote, "We are now witnessing a broader effort to uncover, recover, and elevate black stories of revelation and joy in the American landscape," unquote. A second strategy for closing the enjoyment gap involves paying more attention to nearby natural spaces, for reason of cost and comfort. Far-off natural grandeur may feel out of reach, financially prohibitive for families and culturally alien, reinforcing the sense that nature is elsewhere and belongs to other people. A third strategy for closing the gap involves role modeling from within groups perceived by dominant culture as out of place outdoors. Let me give one example. Christian Cooper has risen from relative obscurity to become America's most famous birder, while inspiring other BIPOC and queer folk who love the outdoors. The disturbing circumstances behind Cooper's sudden visibility are by now all very well known. On May 25th, 2020, the same day that Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd in Minneapolis, Cooper videoed a white woman in Central Park shouting at him, quote, "I'm calling the cops. I'm going to tell them there is an African-American man threatening my life," unquote, which he then did. What Cooper had done was simply ask her to leash her dog in accordance with New York City law. Yet Cooper refused to let that life-endangering encounter destroy his life-giving passion for birds. He continued to insist on his right to outdoor joy. Asked by a probing journalist whether he had dared return to that fateful spot in Central Park, he said yes, indeed he had. And he'd seen a special bird there, the hard-to-find mourning warbler, and the pleasure he took from that bird had eased his trauma. Cooper has successfully parlayed his newfound visibility into advocacy for birds and for improving access to birding among BIPOC and queer constituencies. Out of his defiant proselytizing joy, he has hosted a TV series on birding and a best-selling book, Better Living Through Birding, Notes from a Black Man in the Natural World. He has also helped establish Black Birders Week, a kind of ornithological black counterculture where professional ornithologists and amateurs alike can share field trips and information, while also sharing the particular challenges of birding while black. Black Birders Week brings me to the fourth and arguably the most important strategy that activists are using to close the enjoyment gap, namely banding together around identity. New York's Prospect Park now boasts both queer and feminist birding groups. We've seen BIPOC outdoor-loving women in the US forming a group called We Hike to Heal. Others, like Sira Nagakiri, have founded groups like Disability Hikers. In the UK, Black to Nature and Black Girls Hike offer minority kids the chance to explore nature in each other's company. Also in the UK, Flock Together organizes collective outings for young nature lovers under the banner, quote, "It's not just a white thing," unquote. An outdoor group for British Muslim women has become immensely popular. They call themselves the Wanderlust Women, Muslim women who love, quote, "to hike together, paddleboard, kayak, climb, surf, and find peace in the outdoors," unquote. Their catchy tagline is, quote, "for women who wish to wander," unquote. And this is just a tiny sample of the huge array of identity-centered outdoor groups that have proliferated not only in the UK and the US, but in many other countries, and particularly since COVID. Collectivizing outdoor pleasures may be the most powerful strategy of all. Doing so can help counter a tenacious tradition that posits solitude as the ideal outdoor state. One remembers here that the social reformers who coined the term the great outdoors in the mid-19th century did so in the belief that the immersion in nature could offer a healthy antidote to the urban pollutants spread by the Industrial Revolution. Yet the most influential American and British nature writers, from Wordsworth through Emerson, Thoreau, John Muir, and Edward Abbey, tended to idealize nature as best enjoyed in solitude, which served as a portal to transcendence. Yet groups at heightened risk of harassment, or worse, outdoors, often reject the tyranny of a rapturous solitude that is not exactly an equal opportunity experience. In response then, those marginalized in nature are banding together to normalize their outdoor presence through shared joy. The result, less solitude, more solidarity, because you're more likely to enjoy natural spaces when accompanied by those who understand in their bones the social dimensions to a natural unease, and who understand, moreover, the stressful labor of belonging in places where you may be viewed as an outdoor aberration, an intruder, or even a terroristic threat. We can sense such shared contagious joy emanating from this British group of Muslim hikers, and it's on this note, I'll close the lecture. I'll just press again. Okay. Yep.
It's a sense of celebration, it's a community, it's a chance to socialize. Sometimes it's their first time visiting the countryside, they've never experienced anything like it. Majority people who see us outdoors might initially find it strange seeing such a huge group of Muslims looking like us outside. There's many issues and barriers that hinder our communities from getting outside. Simply not having the outdoors embedded within our cultural and lifestyle norms perhaps is the biggest contributor for the lack of representation.
As well, but I never see any Asians, and it's just great to see people walking here.
Today we bumped into a school teacher in Sheffield who was quite overwhelmed and quite teary, in fact. It's taken 30 years for him hiking locally in the Peak District to see people of his own religion, faith and colour, in essence. Go back to what you were doing before the lockdown and leave this place to proper walkers. I mean, yeah, what are proper walkers? Many of the comments, questioning our integrity and values, suggesting that we're causing litter and, damaging the pathways, etc.
It wasn't nice, but it doesn't deter me personally from getting out there and hiking. But I know some friends that are worried to go out on their own because of that issue.
The thing is, from that, I mean, the kind of outpouring of love and support that we got was amazing. So it kind of shows that they are clearly the minority.
We are here for everyone, and the outdoors is for everyone as well. So I think we should all get outside and enjoy it more.
Right, and so tomorrow I'll pick up on the second lecture, and I want to address ecology and equity from another vantage point. Again, I'll be talking at the interface of environmental justice and a scientific field, in this case forest ecology, and I'll be looking at the new revelations about the underground fungal networks, which have sparked enormous debates across multiple disciplines about non-human intelligence and interspecies cooperation. And so I'll be thinking about how an environmental justice perspective might enrich this already very rich field of understanding and interest. Thank you.
Thank you. Some time for questions. We have microphones around the room. Just raise your hand and then we'll bring the microphone to you.
All right, thank you for that wide-ranging and wonderful talk. And I just wanted to come back quickly to what you were saying about neuroscience, really trying to quantify all the effects of nature or nature deprivation on humans, and whether that kind of quantification leads us into, back into the situation where, our society tends to weigh things in terms of growth, productivity, costs, and benefits. and that there's an acceptance that we can continue to wipe out certain landscapes by saying, well, if we build housing developments here, or if we build, something that constitutes economic growth, well, that's actually a benefit over a set of costs. And when we're making these, kind of neuroscience arguments with quantification, if that just kind of leads us into the same kind of trap of cost-benefit type of analysis, which is always, in the end, going to lead us into a capitalist triumph over that particular situation.
No, I thank you for that question. So clearly we live on a finite planet, and technology is ingenious, maybe not infinitely ingenious, but I am, because like many environmental humanities folks, I'm in a majority science and engineering scenario, so we're in the minority. And I really value that. I learned enormous amount from faculty in data-driven disciplines. But I think one of the things that the humanities can offer is it can open up questions about what are the parameters of non-data-driven knowledge. Because particularly in the universities, there's a kind of a creeping sense of data and knowledge as synonymous. Okay, when you're writing grants and so forth, what's your data set? What's this? And I think one of the things that coming from a humanities and particularly environmental justice vantage point can do is to say that pleasure and health are not always quantifiable. Happiness is very difficult. I mean, we hear all these happiness quotients, but I think they're largely kind of bogus. And peace, something like peace, how do you quantify peace? And in the context of the degrowth movement, the skepticism towards an idea of growth as a positive without any blowback, I do think stories and images have a role to play to diversify and complicate what are human ideals and what are sustainable ideals, given the kind of the juggernaut of global growth and globalization, particularly in a context in which, in most societies, the gap between the uber rich and the abandoned is widening. I mean, I think in 1990, US had 70 billionaires, and there are now 700 billionaires in the US. And there are now 2,800 billionaires in the world. And so, we see on so many fronts, the hollowing out of the middle class and the sense of a super elite and 23% of children in New York living in poverty. How does that work? So I think that is a concern, and it's a point where we can have constructive convergence between social concerns about inequality and ecological concerns with limitless growth. I think there is a meeting place there. So thank you for that.
Hi, thank you so much for this really fabulous lecture. So much to think about, but the thing that caught my attention, I have to say my heart sank when you started talking about the neuroscience part. And I guess the question that I have is why should rights arise out of longevity and public health statistics? What delighted me is when you spoke about pleasure. Pleasure as a right to which we all are entitled. And I understand that this doesn't translate into a policy memo, and perhaps would be difficult to leverage as a catalyst for change. But if we speak as humanists and more philosophically, do we really need to worry about health? I mean, these sort of longevity statistics. Broccoli has benefits as well. A gym in which you exercise can also probably lower your blood pressure and prevent all kinds of diseases. What is it about nature and the pleasures of nature that are different?
So let's take one or two more questions, and
sure.
you can take them at once. Yeah, just one at the back there.
Hi, thanks very much for your question. I noticed a dichotomy in your lecture between the first and the second halves. In the first half, where you talk about how this notion of nature being deeply structured by the legacy of historical and political violence. And in the second half, when you discuss the neuroscience studies, nature appears as something of an undifferentiated whole. And I wonder where you stand on what nature is. Is it a deeply structured environment, or is it one given to natural forces alone? I think of somebody like former Yale scholar William Cronin, who talked about the wilderness being a deeply structured environment. So is your case that nature is a deeply structured environment that we need more access to, or is it one in which human forces have not had a hand in largely shaping?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I think. Oh, sorry. More. Okay.
Hi, Professor. Thank you so much. My name is Rose. I just wanted to first say that I've been actually assigned slow violence in 3 completely different classes, which I think speaks to the cross-cutting nature of that work. So I'm a huge fan. My question is actually relating back to that work, kind of in the context of today's lecture, which is during COVID, when we all experienced this great slowdown kind of universally. I'm wondering if you saw if it caused you to kind of reevaluate or revisit slow violence as a concept, and how the violence that we saw kind of erupt both in a racial sense and an ecological sense during COVID kind of interacted with those theories. I mean, knowing that we saw lots of reduction of carbon emissions that have then since spiked back up since the pandemic, I'm just wondering about how those concepts interacted with the pandemic for you. Thank you.
Well, okay, I'll start. That's the cluster is always easiest to remember the most recent questions. I'll start with this one. Yeah, COVID is very, very relevant. I mean, Christian Cooper talked about it. He'd been birding in Central Park for decades, and he said that since COVID, the number of BIPOC birders in Central Park has increased since the beginning by a factor of 10. That's his, non-statistical judgment. But, I think particularly in the early years of COVID, when a lot of people craved society but were afraid of humans, people of all sorts of backgrounds took to nature and found that sometimes a particular walk repeated every morning or something kept them sane. And then there would be like a spark bird. What's that red bird there? Oh, well, look it up in the book. It's a red cardinal. Then an interest generates or something like that. So that's one side of it. The other side of it has to do with this question of nature. Well, I think the second question is pertinent to this one as well, which is if we think of a dominant tradition within Judeo-Christian thought anyway of humanity as an exceptional species and as a dominant species. And so the whole ideology of dominion that underscored the selective enlightenment and colonialism and so forth was an idea of management and control of nature, and nature is there, taking one particular reading of Genesis, to serve humanity. Okay. Now, clearly COVID was not serving humanity in the ways that most of us liked. And it was a reminder of the importance of species humility in relation to widely distributed agency across the natural world. And so probably not since the great oxygenation event 2.5 billion years ago with cyanobacteria has there been such a huge impact on life on the circumstances of life since, over that period, since the COVID. So I think COVID got people thinking and also changed many people's relationship to the outdoors and the natural world. Which links to the second question about the structured nature and William Cronin's work on wilderness. Now, one of the things that does hearten me a lot about the rise of environmental justice and the connection to social justice more broadly and public health is that the wilderness model that did tend to predominate in an earlier phase of environmentalism was a deeply limiting model, clearly within the US for the reasons that I outlined, but also internationally. And environmental justice allows for a much, much stronger connection to the dominant environmental traditions within most of the global south, I would say. If you're living in Indonesia or Nigeria or the Philippines, the idea of importing an American wilderness ideal is completely impractical. So America is disproportionately wealthy and disproportionately lightly populated, okay? And so in many parts of the world, Latin America, particularly I would say East Africa and Southern Africa, where there were traditions of very strong traditions of colonial conservation, that were rightly perceived as anti-human environmentalism, specifically anti-brown and black human environmentalism. Environmentalism itself, just as it's been tainted, say, in Republican quarters, seen as an ideological world, in much of the global south, environmentalism was saying, oh, that's coming from Washington, D.C. or London or Geneva or that. It has nothing to do with how we live in relation to the ecologies around us. And so I think this is a huge advance. I mean, I think the very idea of environmentalism came with so much baggage that was actually a hindrance to many multifaceted, broad environmental initiatives that are needed. And so that one of the things that can do is help undo some of the epistemic violence of a kind of wilderness-driven model, acknowledging that people who've lived close to the land, close to the waterways, have their own environmental knowledge systems, and that those knowledge systems are actually vital for a broader survival of humanity in the long term. And the first question was about pleasure. Okay. Could you just remind me one more time? Yeah, just.
Why do we want to argue for access to green spaces as based on health and longevity statistics, important as they are for everyone, right? Broccoli can give you health and exercise in a gym, right? So, is pleasure something that maybe can be an argument for a right to a space in a way that isn't tied up with such quantifiable, though they are, factors?
Right. Yeah. I think you're right. There are two ways of looking at this. It can improve longevity, but it can also reduce suffering while we're alive. So however long we're alive, most of us prefer to suffer less, given the option. So, something like chronic asthma, childhood diabetes, people can live a long time with that, but on a day-to-day basis, they're in pain, And so that would be maybe my response there, is that even if we ignore the trillionaires who are hoping to live to 300 or whatever it is, and using that as a role model, sort of coming down, we hope to get an extra year or two. There's another way of looking at it, which is just about suffering and pain, and why on a daily basis, when people can take a walk, an unmolested walk, are other people recoiling from that because it's perceived as unsafe and experienced as unsafe. Yeah.
One very quick. The lessons of your English classes be concise, please. Okay. Should we hear?
Thank you, Professor Nixon. We're really glad to have you here. I was just noticing that this video is from BBC News. And while everyone is expressing a lot of joy in the video, I was wondering if promoting something like hiking works to incorporate certain populations into a British national or civic imaginary. So I was wondering if you could speak to the idea that maybe certain forms of engagement with nature, such as hiking, are more palatable than other forms of engagement, such as when a park is like a homeless shelter.
The question is sort of related to stuff you've already been talking about, and maybe also what she was talking about. I was interested in the theme of surveillance that went through a lot of your examples. And I thought the most interesting example was in Pakistan, where the skies have become the medium for surveillance, and then the clouds are recreate a kind of freedom from surveillance in an urban environment. But then in some of the other examples, it seems like infrastructures that might accompany like more people entering sort of would-be wilderness spaces, turn those spaces into places that become increasingly surveilled, even, you know, if there's already a history of violence in these places. But increasingly, it seems like part of the trend, I guess, in across all your examples was the ways that like getting outdoors exposes you to some kind of to being watched or to potential violence, and how that kind of that seemed to be obviously as a historical trend, but it seems to be moving with people into the outdoors, I guess, if that makes sense. And so I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, if you have any thoughts about like the tradition of understanding the wilderness, so-called, as a place of freedom and solitude and transcendence and getting away from society, but and how that might be, obviously you seem to be thinking or like looking at examples that are kind of counter to that model, but I'm just wondering about like the values of freedom that like might be incorporated in what we think about when we imagine people getting outside and getting away, and how I don't know, I'm just not following Kajetan's direction, to be concise. Just wondering if that's a theme that you've also thought about, and how you're kind of tracking it through your examples.
Follow. I'm just intrigued at the synonym between nature and outdoors, and whether you've thought about whether those are really synonymous in that way. And partly because it did seem to me that even the neuroscientists would have to admit that the unsheltered, the homeless who live outdoors do not experience any of the picnic basket or cornucopia, and how that affects that. I was going to ask that tomorrow, but since it sounds like tomorrow you'll be on other topics.
Right. Okay. Great. Thanks. So I'll start with that one as well. Thanks for that. Yeah, the great outdoors is such a trope, you know, and it was a reformist trope, and it was, associated with health, and then became marketed also within a national context, so that you had, with the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone and so forth, a touristic ideal that was also enfolded into patriotic enterprise. Similarly in the UK with heritage and rambling and certain ideas around that. So yes, so outdoors is the great outdoors especially, is a very selective idea of nature. And what do the destitute and the houseless, what is their experience of nature? It's not for me to presume that, But I remember talking to a car guard in Cape Town that I got to know where in this area I was living. And the car guards are just people who get tips for looking after your car so it doesn't get keyed or stolen or something like that. And he lived in the bushes down on the shore. And I got talking to him, and he said, it's a terrible life that I lead, but he said, the one thing I like is the sound of the sea, because he said it drowns out the rumbling in my stomach. So his reference point was hunger, but the sea helped him, drown that out. So, and I was thinking also in the context of the Palestinian struggle, there are there's a cartoon figure, Handala, who's this little spiky-haired 10-year-old boy. You might have seen cartoons of him with his back turned and his hands like this. And there are usually bombs flying from the sky, or there's prison cell bars and that. But almost in every cartoon, there is a flower, or there's a barbed wire with a piece of wheat coming out of it, or something. There's some residue of the natural world. And so, I think even in destitute circumstances, people can sometimes take a flash of something from a bird song or a flower or that. It's not within my experience to judge that. But one of the reasons I called my previous book, The Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, is because for a long time it was assumed, certainly in dominant environmental circles, that the poor didn't have an environmentalism. They needed to catch up to what the white middle class had already learned. And now I think one of the positive things about this moment is we have a much broader sense of people of all sorts of backgrounds harboring environmental knowledge, and that those need to be integrated and in conversation with each other. Yeah. So where were we with the other ones? This question of surveillance. Yeah. So one of the things that's happening, certainly in the UK a lot, is that you have park improvements. And what's often not, and they're called public-private, enterprises. What's often not noted is that public parks are frequently, almost structurally, being sold off to private enterprises. And the park area is improved, but that's privatized. And so one of the things that the owning entity now has is control over who can, say, for instance, hold a protest in that park. It looks public, but it's no longer public. And I think that feeds into this whole question of surveillance as well, it becomes harder to find non-surveilled spaces. But even within that, there are still discriminations among who is more vulnerable and who isn't. And some of you may have seen this, about a decade before the Christian Cooper incident in Central Park, Drew Lanham, who's an ecologist at Clemson, did a little video called Rules for the Black Bird Watcher. And one of the things was never wear a hoodie. Another was always bird with 3 pieces of ID. And I remember when he talked at Wisconsin, he described how, as a 6'4" black man, he was wanting to do his PhD, and he wanted to do the PhD on a particular migrant warbler. I think it was the Kirtland warbler, which migrates from upper Michigan to the deep south. And his dissertation director said to him, well, he said, this work may make you famous, but it might make you posthumously famous. And so what he ended up doing was he put together a set of maps of all the distribution of all the warblers in America that he was interested in studying, and then he put it another map that he superimposed on that, on the distribution of hate crimes in the South. And then he chose his warbler from there, okay? So, you know, it's just illustrative, again, of the fact that a space isn't a space. It comes with so much history, and pleasure has to be negotiated in a certain way. And it's respecting the labor of that negotiation of pleasure, I think, that is so important to create a fully diverse and more energetic environmental movement. The idea of the more palatable and less palatable ideas of the outdoors. I think people, from my reading and talking to people, people have been excluded from a definitive national tradition, often a mixture of angry and envious. And I'm thinking of a book, I think it's by Noreen Sethi, called I Belong Here. She's a Pakistani, a woman of Pakistani origin, a British woman, who decided to walk the Pennines, which is like a rite of passage for British trail walkers. So she gets on the train, and before she's even got to the trailhead, a group of young white teenagers, drunk teenagers, start abusing her, and she's called the C word and the P word before she's even started walking. And so she said, okay, I've got a gender hate crime and a race hate crime against me, but I'm still going to walk because I'm British, you know. And they say, you know, the usual microaggressions of like, go back to where you came from, etc., etc. And she said, you know, I come from Leeds, you know, whatever. But you know, I think that during COVID, we saw another variant of that, which is I saw a couple of reports that both in the US and the UK, women running in parks, the number of women running in parks went down because of hyped up male aggression. And so if something like that, the COVID-generated male aggression impacted the health outcomes, if you like, of people who wanted to run, but felt there was this kind of atmospheric rage that they didn't want to run into, you know.
We'll have time for more questions tomorrow. At this juncture, please join me in thanking Professor Nixon.